consider that acuity is the refined clarity of thought and perception which enables one to discern subtle truths.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Acuity podcast, Politics and Culture. I'm Dr. Lavranos, the host, and with me on these days, I'm privileged to have Amy Hamm, the communications manager at Acuity Medical Law. It's a little bit more of a somber talk this week. Canada was just devastated with one of our worst mass shootings in history. A very, very troubled young person, Jesse Van Rootsellar, went on a shooting spree after first killing his mother and his sibling before going to a school and shooting multiple children with 10 fatalities and 22 or 23 otherwise injured. So we're going to be talking about that today. And Amy has done a good deal of research on this and will be taking the lead, discussing what we know, the questions that we have, and of course, any kind of summary or analysis that we can provide for you guys, the audience. So thank you so much, Amy, for taking the time and being here with me again today.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very somber moment for Canada, and this is not something that's usual in Canada. We don't have that many mass shootings, and when it happens, it's particularly newsworthy. I know it's more common in the United States, and it doesn't mean that it's less tragic every time it happens, but I think that it affects people in a more profound way when it happens in Canada because it's so shocking.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. It's not necessarily a desensitization. Each time for the community, for the state that's involved, it's always shocking and horrific. But the fact that we don't expect anything like that in Canada adds a different layer of horror to it. People love to play the blame game around weapons, and it's kind of a difficult thing for us to realize that these kinds of violent episodes can happen anywhere at any time, crippling mental health systems, and in this case, cries for help multiple times before, police involvement, and still there is no ultimate final defense, whether it would be a vehicle, whether it would be a gun, whether it would be a knife, like we see in the UK. People who have this intent will find a way.
Yeah, and I'll just put up this photo right now. So the girl on the left, her name is Maya. She was shot in the head and the neck, and she was airlifted to a Vancouver area hospital. She was not expected to survive the night last night, and yet she is still alive, which is incredible. And I think the entire country is praying for this little girl. And unfortunately, these other two photos are two of the confirmed victims, and their families have spoken to media and shared their photos and shared their sorrow. And it's just, I know we're both parents too. It's just so incredibly difficult to try to comprehend the loss and the sorrow and the pain and the anger that these families and the entire community is going through. It's hard to make sense of it. And I think in trying to comprehend this grief, what makes it even worse is the fact that you have the Canadian establishment through mainstream media and through police that are trying to obscure the truth about who committed this crime and possibly why they committed this crime. When the shooting happened, the residents of Tumbler Ridge, BC, this is a northern community in British Columbia, received notification through their phones on the emergency alert system that there was an active shooter. And so what first happened was that police sent out this warning, and they described the shooter as a, quote, female in a dress. The moment that I heard that, it set off alarm bells in my head, and I wondered, why would they say female in a dress? You never hear people talking about a male shooter wearing pants. Why is the dress relevant? And then I just thought, are they actually not a female? That led me to start looking online about, is anybody talking about the potential of this being a trans shooter? And sure enough, there were several local residents in Tumbler Ridge posting about how the shooter was a trans-identified male teenager right from the get-go. It's so absolutely sickening that the and this is the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, our national police force, is apparently more concerned with not being politically incorrect by not referring to someone by the quote unquote wrong pronouns than with the immediate safety of the community, because it's very clear that it was a male shooter. And, the fact that they tried to say in a dress, it was almost like they're trying to give a hint, because they knew that if they said a female shooter, it would have dangerous consequences. Obviously, saying female in a dress still has dangerous consequences, so they didn't do a very good job of mitigating that. And it's just so inexcusable and disgusting. I'm just absolutely enraged and still shocked by what they did.
Yes. So there's a lot to unpack there. So firstly, the appropriate description of a gunman is really important. If the shooter was still at large, obviously an appropriate description so that the public can get involved and aid is very helpful. And it has often, even in the last year, been shown to be critical, right? I mean, like we saw with Tyler Robinson in the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the description, the pictures, and so on, is what led the father to challenging, and then I think it was an uncle or a pastor who got involved, and so on. So the proper fullness of the description is, from a pragmatic point of view, really important. The second thing I would offer there is that is sort of an immediate politicization of the events. It's an immediate political perspective. So that is sort of offensive in general to the population, right? I mean, there's a lot of baggage, there's a lot of controversy that comes with a description like that, especially in such a horrendous time of crisis. So I think that that's also misplaced. Now, if we're going to steel man the position, if this is official policy, and if this is like the official guide that either the police force or the RCMP would have to follow as far as protocol goes, which I'm not sure if it is or if it isn't, then certainly the officers involved, the detectives, the captain, whoever it is not necessarily at fault. But then one should ask, well, what are those policies, and do they need to be addressed? Because from a pragmatic point of view, that can be a big disservice to the law enforcement effort.
Absolutely. And this reminds me of a story that I reported on a couple of years ago, where there was someone committing sexual assault on Vancouver Transit. It was the same thing, where the language in the police report referred to her DNA was left at the scene. So I contacted the police, and then I said, "What do you mean her DNA? Are you referring to sperm?" And then they told me, "Yes, we're talking about sperm." Her sperm? No. Just how dare you lie?
From a biological perspective, I mean, that's like nonsensical, that's farcical, right? I mean, there's like a blatant oxymoron. But again, just think about the mass confusion that has, that confusion that happens in records, and then, the posterity sake of news and quote unquote papers of record, in 1 year, in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. How do people reflect and look back at that, notwithstanding all of the other complicating factors of how we address the root cause of this? Because it's a very natural human instinct to look at a tragedy like this and be like, well, what can be done, right? And that's a much bigger and broader question, given that this person was trans. The record keeping, especially from a journalistic ethics point of view and from a law enforcement ethics point of view, there's something to be said about the integrity of how those records are maintained and what is their value subsequently. So yeah, I mean, like, offensive just to our common sense, but then on a bigger scale, the pragmatic view of the repercussions of this kind of language is much more confusing, and it's still very controversial. So it's not even a settled thing. It's an open debate in Canada. It's an open debate in the West. So very, very misplaced at this time, very misplaced.
On the screen right now, we're showing photos of the shooter, one when he was pre-transition, and we know now that the family had a lot of guns in the home, that they were sort of raised to learn how to shoot, and at one point the shooter obtained a firearms license. And then on the right you see a photo of him after he had transitioned.
So let me ask, because obviously a part of this, Canada does not have a particularly large gun culture, unlike the United States. Where we have pockets of gun culture, they are very, very strongly adherent to that. They really enjoy it, whether it's recreational, whether it's hunting, whatever the case might be. I happen to fall much closer to the U.S. on the principle of gun ownership. I think that the principal value of that is both with respect to the defense of the person, what we call like castle laws. Police obviously cannot respond fast enough for something that could go wrong, and some means of defense of your personhood, your loved ones, and your property just seems totally intuitive to me. But at a broader sense, the idea that a well-armed militia would be a defense against tyranny also is extremely compelling argument. I know a lot of Canadians don't like to think of that, and they don't like to sort of put themselves in that kind of a position where some kind of tyrannical government is going to put down on them, and that they may have to resort to weapons in order to file out some form of defense. But the point is that it's actually a deterrence. It's not that we would all be rallying in the streets and attacking our own government and law enforcement en masse. We have seen Canada alone already engage in authoritarian behavior. We saw that throughout COVID. We had multiple court decisions to say that freezing of bank accounts and the claiming of monies associated with that was illegal and was unconstitutional. So it's not as though tyranny and authoritarianism is a far cry in any nation. It can happen at the stroke of a pen. I mean, Ronald Reagan is famous for saying that liberty is only one generation away from dissolving. And we see many, many examples in developed nations across the world, even so much of the last 25, 30 years, where this has happened, whether it was the referendum in Catalonia, whether it was the overthrowing of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the military taking over and putting General Sisi at the head, whether it was what we saw in Thailand. The number of instances is just tremendous. So this can happen, and the role of guns in society are very beneficial. And we haven't even talked about its role in defending vulnerable people when they're just walking around the streets and minding their own business. I mean, an FBI report showed that about 8 to 1 or 10 to 1 was the number of crimes that guns defended victims from compared to the number that they were perpetrated against. It's overwhelmingly positive. So I think that that's a worthwhile conversation to have in the context of this, because the first inclination might be, well, the guns are at fault. And ultimately, like I said at the beginning, it would be the shooter who was at fault. And very often we find that they find some way of committing a mass atrocity, even if they don't have access to a particular weapon class.
Yeah, it's interesting because, in America, they have the First and Second Amendment rights, which protect the First Amendment protects free speech. The Second Amendment protects the right to bear arms, including guns. And what we don't see people engaging in a sort of philosophical argument about why do these rights need to be protected in a society and in a country, in a democracy. And when it comes down to it, I'm a free speech absolutist, and I've argued before that the harms that might occur from absolute free speech are worth the cost, because the ultimate price is your own freedom. And so Americans tend to make the same argument about firearm rights. And a lot of Canadians, I think, feel that that's an insane argument because they look at all of the gun deaths in America. But it's true. It's like this is just something we don't even consider in Canada. We don't even look at it as a sort of philosophical argument or an argument towards maintaining democracy. We haven't seen it so far with mainstream media talking about gun laws, but I have seen a lot of people theorizing that this latest mass shooting is going to be used to sort of further the Canadian government's agenda, which already exists, where they do the firearm buyback programs and they try to restrict firearms more and more, despite the evidence that suggests that most of the gun violence in Canada, at least, is from people who obtain firearms illegally and are involved in gangs.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, by definition, criminals don't follow laws. So this process of trying to remove guns from the law-abiding citizens would fall on the deaf ears of criminals. So categorically, I think there was a CTV headline. I did not bother to click and read the article, talking about how mass shooting has motivated stricter gun policies in Canada in the past. And again, going back to the politicization argument, the dust hasn't settled. There are still victims still fighting for their lives. So a bit of an untimely time to have that kind of conversation. To the point about the gun buyback program, certainly that was already raging right? Nova Scotia had already said that they were not going to comply or empower the police to go through that process, and many other provinces did the same. But that being said, this will obviously reawaken that whole conversation, and we'll have to see where that goes. To your point about your rights, there is no right that doesn't have some cost. And the question is always, from a deontological point of view, right? Is this an argument over principles that I always have the right to bear arms, that I always have the right to free expression, free worship, and that these are inalienable, endowed by a creator? Or is this something that I'm willing to sacrifice to an authority that did not bestow upon me those rights, so that I can then be mitigated from a sense of safety for some consequence, as minute that possibility or risk might be? When it comes to freedom of expression, a lot of people think to themselves, like we've seen most prolifically in the UK, that, criticizing and condemning somebody online violates their new legislation for censorship, but the net cost to society is they presume to be a net benefit, that ultimately people will be nicer and so on, and people will be protected. But we have to approach that with a very, very fine grain of sand, because Edmund Burke has a very famous line of philosophy and conservatism talking about how all government intervention has to be weighed extremely carefully, because the unintended consequences are not something that you can easily foresee. And so you can look to history as your examples, but really there is no perfect model. And so you have to exercise a high degree of caution if you're going to enact some kind of intervention, especially when the intervention is of such a large and tyrannical scale, whether it's censorship, whether it's the removal of the right to self-defense, whether it's the removal of the right to recreation and enjoyment and leisure, if that is for hunting or sport purposes or whatever the case might be. Those are really tricky conversations to have, and they should not happen quickly or easily, just because people are acutely emotionally triggered by some kind of horrific occurrence, as we see with Jesse in BC.
This is going to go down as the third worst mass shooting in Canadian history, and it's horribly tragic. I think this narrative about guns is going to come up, but what the mainstream media, the government, what the police are already trying to suppress are the facts and the reality about who committed the shooting and why they committed the shooting, and what have they done, potentially, including our medical system, which pushes the transition of minors who, a lot of these minors who are experiencing gender dysphoria have myriad other mental health issues that are not being addressed, including the shooter who had posted on his archived Reddit account that since he had started taking cross-sex hormones, he wasn't able to access appropriate mental health care. So he was able to access gender-affirming care. He was able to easily access estrogen treatments as a young male with mental health issues, but he wasn't able to access appropriate care for the other mental health problems that he clearly had. And he had just, he had described about having ADHD. It sounded like he had been experiencing psychosis. He made a post about taking hallucinogenics and almost burning his house down. Like, this is very clearly an extremely troubled person.
When it comes to the failures of the healthcare system and the system sort of more broadly, you raise a really good point, because the question can't be limited to, well, it was the guns. We have to think a little bit more about other antecedents to the immediate events, right? And in this instance, we see many opportunities for intervention that may have made a difference. We don't know that they would have, but certainly may have made a difference. Whether that was from better access to healthcare, specifically mental health, which is something that you would know a tremendous amount. But then also the police had been involved and guns had been confiscated and then returned, and there were multiple red flags. And is there some way that either the police have greater authority when it comes to disturbed individuals? And then we talk about the whole role of transgenderism, gender-affirming care, and the role that plays physiologically, hormonally, and psychologically. We've seen many large-scale medical institutions, whether that was firstly, the Plastic Surgery Association of America, coming out saying that they are no longer advocating for gender-affirming care in minors. And then very shortly thereafter, the American Medical Association iterated something the same. And so we're already seeing a scaling back of that, whether it was the NHS in the UK closing the Tavistock Clinic, and of course all the policies and associations with gender-affirming care there, and then the litigation that we're seeing, most notably recently in New York with the $2 million settlement of a detransitioner. So the medical side of things for this avenue of healthcare has always been shaky at best, and that's putting it very optimistically. It's been largely founded. It's been largely founded on very weak science, and most of the science shows no net benefit or potentially a net harm. And so we have to ask ourselves, what role did the healthcare system play, not only in failing to address the mental health needs of the individual, but also what are the resources devoted to the gender affirming side versus other avenues. Last week we talked about MAID and what are the potential consequences of resource allocation when it comes to research and development or palliative care. And so, there's only so many dollars that can go around, and the prioritization of these things plays a role in terms of the opportunity cost, whether it's to mental health care or other institutions that we have, law enforcement, public services, whatever the case might be. And that opens up an entire huge conversation about how we could have probably or hopefully been able to avert this tragedy from happening to begin with.
What I noticed from being on the inside, I've done a lot of different types of nursing. I've worked in neuropsychiatry, I've done primary care, outreach nursing in the downtown east side. And the job that I most recently had before I was sort of fired for speaking out about my political views was as a nurse educator in a psychiatry, mental health, and addictions program. Something that is so obvious to everyone who works in the system is that, and it's so clear that this is the result of harm reduction policies where we enable persons with addictions to continue to use. What was apparent over the years was that the amount of clients who were mentally ill as a result of substance use, they would increasingly take over the beds in acute inpatient psychiatry, whereas they used to be sort of a minority of patients. They became increasingly and overwhelmingly our patients. And obviously that would crowd out the persons who had ongoing mental illness and mental health care issues, because you have to assess someone's acuity and how unwell they are. And these persons who have drug-induced psychosis are, being shuffled into beds to resolve their drug-induced psychosis, and they're displacing persons with other serious mental health concerns. So I question whether or not someone like this shooter was another sort of victim of our really collapsing mental health care system that can't provide appropriate care for persons because of the side effect of harm reduction, which is bringing in so many addicts that have mental health issues as a direct result of their usage of drugs, which is encouraged and promoted by our health authorities and our government.
I mean, that is a great example of how resources in a public healthcare system are going to move, and there are downstream consequences that are not always easily predictable when it comes to policies that are not even directly affecting that. So harm reduction leads to more users, leads to more psychosis induced by drugs, and then so on and so on. And so we see the same kind of scenario play out with the latest mass shooting, because obviously resources are a limitation, whether it's the policing services or otherwise, and decisions have to be made. And every memo that is drafted and sent out talking about respecting pronouns and gender positivity is going to be a memo that was not sent out about a training standard or encouraging more recruiting or whatever the case might be. And so naturally there are consequences, which goes right back to the sort of Edmund Burke approach of these interventions have to be with a very, very light touch, and you don't disturb systems unless you have a high degree of confidence that the intervention you're going to apply is going to have a net benefit.
Absolutely. So I want to talk about next the fact that, our distrust in mainstream media and our disgust with them also extends to the fact we saw this and we spoke about this in the case of Alex Preddy. He was killed by ICE agents. And then mainstream media applied filters to his photos to make him look more attractive, more muscular. They made his face look better. And believe it or not, we've seen the same thing now in Canada, where City News, a Canadian media outlet, has used a beauty filter on on the face of the mass shooter to try to make him appear female and to try to make him appear more attractive as a female than he naturally was. What other situation, aside from a trans-identified person would would the Canadian media be concerned with making this person look more female and more beautiful? If a woman had committed this shooting and she was an unattractive woman, overweight, or not a nice face, would they apply beauty filters to her? No, they wouldn't. Why
Yeah.
would they do this to this
Yeah.
male shooter?
Yeah, immediately offensive. Immediately, anybody who would recognize or see that this editing filter was applied should, the knee-jerk reaction is to think that this is absolutely disgusting. And then, firstly, it's a violation of some kind of journalistic standards. I cannot imagine that it isn't. And one would have to ask the question of why. I mean, like, the consequences, of course, are that it further erodes the trust in these legacy institutions, which, by the way, the Liberal government consistently gives absolutely massive amounts of taxpayer funding in order to buttress because of low viewership and struggling times and ad revenue collapsing and so on, or to buy favorable reporting for the Liberal government itself. And so the institutions of media in Canada, the credibility is shot, and they keep doing these sorts of things that are just further eroding trust. If we wanted to steelman the position, what would be the best case argument that they could provide as to why they would do something along those lines? I can't think of anything other than to generate sympathy for the shooter. I cannot think of any other reason. And that is so offensive. It's so absurd on its face. One would think that, if anything, wouldn't the opposite be more acceptable? Right? Wouldn't the opposite be more acceptable? Isn't this someone that we should condemn in society? Isn't this someone who just destroyed the lives of countless people? And so the idea that we would flatter the shooter by providing them a beauty filter is, I can't even try to steelman the position. Is it something that you see on the journalistic side, Amy? Is it a common practice? Is it some kind of policy? Is it something to do with the cameras, the network, or anything along those lines? I mean, I can't think of something that might defend why you would do that.
It is an extreme violation of journalistic standards to alter photos in this way. The only, and I have a degree in journalism. I studied journalism. I also took photojournalism courses. And the only acceptable edits to any photos that a journalist takes would be to correct something to make it align with reality. Like, let's say you go and you took a photo of an event and you accidentally overexposed it. So you can correct the exposure to make it align with reality. And that's the only reason that you should be editing photos. You don't crop them to crop out inconvenient truths. You don't apply, it's just like, it's such an insane departure from journalistic standards, from truth, from reality. And it's so absolutely sickening. And then the fact that our population seems to be so brainwashed by far left, liberal and transgender ideology that they don't immediately recognize how disturbing this is. And the fact that this, whether or not you feel sympathetic or believe that, oh, nobody should be talking about the fact that this person is trans, you should be deeply offended by the fact that the journalists who are in charge of telling you the truth are lying to you. You always have to go back to basic principles. And if you have a profession who is journalism is a very principled profession, as is medicine. It's like medicine, do no harm. Journalism, it's like you talk about the truth. And when you have the establishment media willing to defy these very basic principles of the profession, you know that we're extremely lost and just profoundly disturbed. And the fact that so many people don't even see a problem with it is really disheartening.
Yeah, it is one of the most unfortunate indicators of Canadian society that legacy media institutions still preserve such a high confidence from the average Canadian. Most of the polls that I saw in the last year and a half have suggested that, whereas in the United States, about 25 or 30% of people still hold a favorable view of legacy media. In Canada, it's exactly the inverse. It's greater than 60%, approaching 70% of people still hold a favorable view. And we see things like this. We've seen so many things between the Conservative Party and the CBC. Even now, we see that CBC panel, and they're constantly harassing Conservatives, and the bias is just so flagrant. It is remarkable to think that people wouldn't look at that and immediately recognize it for what it is. And yet the confidence that Canadians have, whether it's CTV or CBC or any of the large newspaper outlets, is maintained at a very high rate.
Even if somebody tells a lie and it's in your favor and it's a lie that benefits you, you should still be concerned and angry and not trust the person who told the lie. You don't do that, because you cannot trust a liar. You cannot trust persons who violate the core principles of their profession. It doesn't matter whether or not in the moment it benefits you. And I just think people have so lost the notion of caring about these core principles, including, like we talked about, democracy, free speech. There's even an argument about whether or not the right to bear arms is a component of democracy. And it's something that has been so far removed from Canadian society that it's not even acceptable to talk about that anymore, which is wild. But I can't imagine being a parent of a murdered child, or Maya, who's the victim fighting for her life, and seeing mainstream media applying beauty filters to your child's attempted murderer. It's
the idea is gut wrenching. It's maddening to think that would happen. And again, given that this, I have the blessing of being removed from the tragedy directly, trying to put myself in that position, trying to give them any kind of benefit of the doubt. What is the defense that they could possibly mount? I cannot see something like that except to try and flatter and gain greater sympathy for the shooter.
Yeah. And, a lot of left-wing, quote unquote, influencers have been speaking about their concerns that right-wing persons would use this to benefit their narrative, to talk about how they, quote unquote, hate trans people, which is not true. And to suggest that media shouldn't be reporting on the facts because to do so would, be offensive to this protected community. It's so insane to take that approach. So let's say there was a parent who lost a child, and all they were posting about online was to say, oh, I'm concerned about trans ideology. Maybe at that point you could question their motivation. Maybe, because obviously they would be more concerned with the death of their child than the identity of the shooter. But the role of media and of people who are asking questions about why it happened is to uncover the truth and to figure out what happened and why did it happen, and to try to shame people into not asking those questions. In particular, the media is just a blatant attempt to hide the truth.
And I mean, if the vulnerability of the trans community is something that you should have sympathy for, then kudos to you. And I think that is ultimately a virtuous position to take. But what does that have to do with this particular shooter, right? I mean, the strength of the argument should resist the fact that in this instance, it was a trans-identifying person who was the mass shooter. So, you should be able to defend the position you have taken without having to bend the truth, alter the truth, without having to greatly offend all the victims involved with the shooting. So, let the rigor of your perspective, the rigor of your position stand for what it is. And if the evidence and the argument is on your side, then you will win the day. Doing this is a disservice to that position itself, because what is the average person, what is the average open-minded Canadian going to think when they see that, right? Are you actually even helping your side by trying to drive more sympathy towards a mass shooter, and you're doing it sort of unethically, or does it sort of weaken the credibility of the person who's making that argument? And so if we look at, the core mantra, right? The motto of Acuity medical law is logos, ethos, and pathos. And ethos is the ethics of the person who's making the argument. And so you are losing the strength of your position by doing things like this. So strategically, it's a wrong thing to do. Morally, it's a disgusting thing to do. So I can't see that there's any kind of a defense for it, to be honest.
I agree. And let me just share, there was a Colette article. I think it was first published back in November of last year, October of last year, saying we need to talk about trans-identified killers because it's very obvious to anyone who follows the news that there seems to be a pattern emerging whereupon a lot of the prominent mass shootings have been committed by persons who are gender dysphoric, they're non-binary, they're either a trans male who's a female taking testosterone, or a trans uh, male who's taking estrogen. When you look at statistics, let me bring this up. So when you look at the current stats for mass shootings, it hasn't been established yet that there is a disproportionate number of trans-identified persons committing these mass shootings. And yet, this seems to be a relatively new phenomena. And there's this quote that I used from PolitiFact, or the Poynter Institute, where they were quoting University of Alabama Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice professor saying, I think it's reasonable to assert that anecdotally there have been several high-profile mass shootings committed by transgender individuals in recent years. And whether that is an aberration or a new trend hasn't yet been confirmed statistically. But how dare anyone suggest that we don't notice what is emerging as a clear trend and wonder whether or not this is going to change. And it's not like I want more shootings to happen to confirm the trend, but it
Exactly.
really feels like it's a trend at this point.
Exactly. So, I mean, when it comes to, the time and for some sort of intervention or some kind of change, policy-wise, medical guideline-wise, how far down a road do you want to go before you try to recalibrate? And it's a bit of a balancing act, right? Because we don't want to force an intervention that could have other downstream effects. But the question has to be asked, right? First, that there's a alarming number of trans ideology-related shootings and assaults is at this point a near guarantee. But also a large proportion of the community that is suffering as a consequence of this are other trans people. And so the amount of domestic violence, the amount of assaults within that community is also very high. So even from a compassion point of view, which I always say is kind of funny, because from the left, compassion can only run down one street, right? It can only be towards this community. It cannot be towards the victims. It cannot be towards society at large. It cannot be towards taxpayers or anything else. It has to always be based on compassion of just this one community. But even if we take a step away from that, if you do want to have compassion for this community, maybe the way that we are prescribing hormones is wrong. Maybe the doses have to be much lower. Maybe it has to be much more gradual. Maybe they have to be well over the age of 25. Maybe they have to be over the age of 30. There are so many ways that you can still maintain a sympathy and compassion for the community, but want to know what is going on. So asking the question, why did this happen, and where were the safeguards, and what are the antecedent causes, and what are the possibilities for intervention? Those do not have to be quote unquote transphobic. They don't have to even be anti-trans. Those questions can literally be pro-trans. Like we've talked about, whether it's the media, whether it's the police, all these people trying to put a color or a spin on it in order to try and be defensive or protective, are doing a tremendous disservice to everyone.
They are. And, I often think about how I've been portrayed in media, including the CBC, and a lot of other, by a lot of other sort of left-wing influencers as being one of the worst, most transphobic persons in this country. And then I think I don't even have such a strong stance as some people have towards the trans issue, because I really don't care what consenting adults choose to do to their bodies. And I have sympathy for adults who experience gender dysphoria and they're uncomfortable with their biological sex, and they decide to do things to change their bodies to align with more how they would like to look and how they would like to feel. I really don't care. And I sympathize with these people. My only issue is that there's this lie being sold that you can literally change your sex. And I have trans friends, and they recognize that they are not literally the opposite sex, and they don't intrude upon women's spaces, and they don't perceive themselves as this eternal victim, and everyone hates them, and everyone's transphobic. Like, it's just, there's such a wide range of people in this community, and it traditionally was sort of more rational people. And it's really this, in the last 10 years, that this movement has gotten so ideological and so cultish. and so driven by lies, including this notion that you can be born in the wrong body, and that you have, it's essentially a belief in mind-body dualism, um, which is not, you cannot scientifically prove that somebody has a sort of gender soul that is separate from their physical body. That's an unfalsifiable belief and idea. And yet our medical system has decided to embrace this and assert that it's fact, and to immediately affirm anyone's gender as soon as they say it on the basis of that. And then you have to wonder, is this Jesse mass shooter, is he someone who fell victim to this ideology in the medical system? Because he clearly had a lot of ongoing mental health issues going back at least a decade. So what I'm sharing right now, right after I was wondering if this shooter was a trans person, and then I found locals saying that it was, I searched Jennifer Strang's social media, and what I happened to discover that we were both in a private Facebook group together, a parenting group in Canada, and I looked at all of her posts going over the years, and I found these posts from 2015 when Jesse, who's the mass shooter, when he was 7 years old, and she was saying, like, please don't judge me, I'm just looking for help. But she expressed concern that her son was having behavioral issues, and that the school and teachers were pushing for behavioral assessments. And she also said that he would hurt his own siblings and have a devious grin after doing so, and that he would cover things up, he would lie, he would try to get out of taking responsibility for what he did, and also that his behavior would be different at school than it was at home. Like, he would do these manipulative things at home, hurting people, hurting his siblings, and displaying this devious grin. He was able to do that not at school, but just at home. And then, she described how sometimes he was helpful and other times she was worried about how mean he was. So I think this tragically is a case of like a kid that had severe issues and maybe antisocial personality disorder, and somehow ended up being pushed into the gender affirming care craze that's going on in Canada right now.
Yeah, and I mean, like, what a tragic example of, is this the kind of person, is this the kind of mind that would benefit from all kinds of hormonal treatments, or are those going to make the situation considerably worse? Is this the kind of person who's going to be bettered by embracing the gender dysphoria, empowering that, or is that someone who watch and wait approach would have been better served? And so this asks all those questions that literally people who have tremendous sympathy for the trans community should also want to ask. This is not a political position at all. This is something that everybody should be able to agree with, and totally outside any kind of politicization. I think that certainly in the not too distant future, we will have a much longer conversation about gender affirming care, transgenderism, and all the controversies and issues that we see surrounding that. But it's just so tragic that all of these lives have been forever ruined as a consequence of something that seems to have had many opportunities for intervention before it. Many. 10 years worth is just an alarming amount of time for all these cries for help to have been addressed by some process, some power.
This is a little bit tangential, but I'm also disturbed by seeing the number of people online who are so quick to blame the mother of this shooter, who was the first victim, by the way. The son murdered the mother, which is extremely disturbing. And it's clear from, if you look back at her social media posts, that she has 5 children. She's a loving mother. All like most of her posts are sharing about her kids and how much she's proud of them and how much she loves them. And then she had this kid that, at least, going back a decade, she was clearly very concerned about his behavior. And then you have people just trashing her and saying, why is she a single mom? Maybe it's her fault because the father wasn't involved. Again, it's like all of this grief seems to be compounded, at least for me, because I'm like a single mother. And then I've received a lot of hate for that too. And people tend to look at you and assume that you've done something wrong. And we don't know the details. Maybe the father left and wasn't in the picture because he was a bad person. He was also a sociopath. We don't know any of those details, but to automatically just blame the mother, I think, is very very misogynistic and upsetting, and just an indictment of our culture, that it's like you refuse to look at the role of gender ideology, and instead you're just so easily willing to blame one of the victims of the crime and insist, oh, well, it's her fault because she's a single mom. And who's blaming the father? Nobody.
Yeah, I think that it's extremely. I think it's disgusting. First off, no one has the level of details required in order to pass the blame on to the mother. The police, no one at this point. I mean, it's just far too soon for claims like that to be made with any kind of credibility. Secondly, to your point, at the very least, from what we see, is several cries of help from the mom, right? For those who have the perspective of, gender affirming care as a net benefit, we see that the mom did go down that route, probably almost certainly on the strong advice and recommendation from many authorities. And so, I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for parents in that situation. They are obviously trying to do their very best. And that doesn't mean that they don't make mistakes, but they're trying to do their best. So ascribing a high degree of blame to the mother who was the first victim, just that is abhorrent to me. Not tasteful at all, not reasonable, really offensive. And to make a claim like that, you should have such a high degree of confidence to say that. I mean, if we're going to look in my heart and see how I feel about the whole situation, this is a profoundly disturbed individual. And I think outside the grace of God, I don't know what interventions could have been made. But for me to come out here and say with any degree of confidence, oh yeah, this was the problem. I mean, that is remarkably short-sighted. It speaks to a rather low intellect, to be honest, that you have already come to a conclusion when you have no knowledge of all the things that you literally don't know that should inhibit that kind of reflection.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is people are accusing journalists, including myself, of talking about the identity of the shooter and caring about the truth of who did it. And they're saying, well, you're just hateful, you're motivated by anti-transness. And no, that's not true, because you have to examine, why did this happen? What were the motivations? And we know that this was a trans-identified person. We also know that this was someone that had mental health issues going on. That is the underlying point, is this isn't an attack on trans people. This is being able to ask reasonable questions about, why did this happen? What were the motivations? What were the factors that led to it? And you will never find out the truth if you refuse to even acknowledge this person's basic identity, and you just insist upon calling him female and tossing under the rug the fact that this was an underage youth that was undergoing a medical transition with cross-sex hormones. I'm not saying that trans people are bad or violent. What I'm saying is we have to explore the idea of, why did this violence happen? And is this relevant? Is this part of why it happened? And
yeah, you're exactly right. Of course you are. The fact that there's a public interest in this story is prima facie reasonable. There are a tremendous number of controversies surrounding the policies that are involved, from policing to guns to gender affirming care, to mental health resources, to medications, pharmacology, the nuances of the medicine, and so on and so on. So there's a tremendous public interest involved, number one. And number two, even from, again, if we're looking at this from the most sympathetic lens, why would people, how could somebody come to a conclusion that the mother was not at fault in the absence of the examination and investigation by journalists? And so even from the position of people being misinformed, right, walking around saying, well, that's just another violent trans person, or, well, that's just another crazy single mom, to try and dispel those myths in society is actually really, really important. And so the investigation, examination by journalists such as yourself is entirely reasonable and provides a tremendous public service.
Yeah, I think the point right now is that what is political is hiding the truth, and the accusations that persons are being political for insisting that the truth be told and insisting that the facts go on public matter. No, that's not political at all. What you're doing is political. And I'll just quickly pull up this, the Toronto Star today talking about police have finally identified the female shooter. No, it's not a female. And then there was an RCMP deputy commissioner, Dwayne McDonald, who did a press release, and in a video he referred to the person as a female even after a journalist asked a question about a male, and then said, oh, we identified the suspect as they chose to be identified in public and social media. And it's interesting that he used the word they. We identified the suspect as they chose to be identified, which to me led me to think this guy's not even comfortable. So if he was comfortable with doing what he was told to do by the organization, he would have said, I will say we identified the suspect as she chose to be identified. But he didn't. He said they. So I think, we've got this whole system of people being forced to go along with the lies and the ideology. And even this police officer is not able to maintain using the correct language because it's so, I think everybody knows it's like we're all being told to lie and too many people are going along with it. And then, again, the CBC today is still referring to the shooter as a female. This clip, the RCMP said Jesse Van Rootsellar, 18, killed her mother and stepbrother. This was from this morning after it had been widely reported around the world that it's a trans-identified male.
Well, this was a absolutely horrific event. This will be a historic event in Canada, and we will make a donation to the poor little girl still fighting for her life in hospital. And this is a conversation that is absolutely worth having. And I think that, you closed it very well when you said that we're all being told and being forced to follow along a lie. And that can be a lie by omission, by omitting the examination that we owe to the victims and to society at large, or it can be a lie of commission by saying things that are obviously untrue that will enter the public record going forward, can influence policies and confuse the public. So a word of caution to everybody to make sure that the truth is a guiding principle in your lives, in your investigation, your examination in society. And we wish the survivors, the victims and their families, the very best through what is obviously an absolutely horrific occasion that will forever affect their lives.
Absolutely. And please, in the coming hours, days, keep Maya in your thoughts. She's such a beautiful little 12-year-old girl, and she's the one remaining victim who's clinging to life. And, her, just keep thinking about her. She, as I said, she was expected to not survive the night, and she did, and she's such a fighter. So I think the whole country is going to be watching and just waiting and feeling the grief, and it would just be so miraculous and wonderful if she comes out of this. So keep her in your thoughts and prayers.
So she does have a donation page to the family that we encourage everybody to go and find. I'm sure that it's a GoFundMe. Of course, we will be making a donation, and send your thoughts and prayers. They play a bigger role than you think, both for your own comfort, to display that commonality, that common humanity with your neighbors or somebody who's suffering from a horrendous tragedy. And also, you never know who's listening, so send your prayers.
My friends, let us consider that acuity is the refined clarity of thought and perception which enables one to discern subtle truths.